Every autumn, several American states open an official hunting season for crows, the same way they do for deer or duck. You can walk into a sporting goods store in most of the country and buy a crow hunting license before lunch. Now try to find crow on a single restaurant menu anywhere in the country. You will not. Not one. A chicken and a crow are both, in a strict legal sense, animals a person is allowed to kill in nearly every American state. Only one of them ends up on a plate. So, if the law allows it, and the bird is right there, legally, why does eating a crow still feel like something closer to a crime than a meal? Most people assume the answer is simple biology. Crows and seagulls eat garbage, so we treat them like garbage, and that instinct feels ancient, something baked into humans the same way a fear of spoiled meat is baked in. But that assumption skips over something the law itself makes very clear, which is that the United States did not always draw a hard line around which wild birds could be killed and eaten. And when it finally did, in 1918, it drew that line for reasons that had almost nothing to do with taste or disgust. This video is going to trace that line from its actual legal origin through a much older written tradition. Most people have never connected to it, through a real, documented American attempt to erase the whole thing completely, and into the genuine biological and medical reasons that exist underneath all of it. Reasons most people have never heard, because they have nothing to do with the disgust reaction they assume is doing all the work. By the end, the question will not be why humans avoid these two birds. It will be how many separate, unrelated decisions had to line up across 3,000 years and several different countries to make that avoidance feel like a single, simple instinct. If untangling law, history, and biology from simple gut instinct is the kind of investigation you want more of, this channel is worth sticking around for. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 is the reason most wild birds in America cannot legally be hunted, killed, or possessed at all without a specific permit. It was passed to stop commercial hunters from wiping out entire species for feathers and meat, and it covers the overwhelming majority of native birds, including gulls. Seagulls are protected under that law today. Killing one without authorization is a federal violation, regardless of how many of them are standing on a pier stealing fries. Crows are a documented exception. Federal regulations allow a specific depredation order for American crows, permitting lethal control when they are causing agricultural damage. And on top of that, nearly every state in the country, all of them except Hawaii, runs its own recreational crow hunting season every year. That means the bird most people assume is protected by the same instinct that protects the seagull is, in the eyes of American law, treated closer to a game animal than a symbol. The taboo against eating one has almost nothing to do with legality. You are allowed to shoot a crow, clean it, and cook it in every state where it is legal to hunt one at all. Almost nobody does. Meanwhile, do that same thing to an unauthorized gull, and you are looking at a federal misdemeanor that can carry fines running into the thousands of dollars, along with the loss of hunting privileges in most of the country. The law is not vague or symbolic here. It draws an unmistakably sharp, specific, bird-by-bird line, and that line simply does not match the one most people assume exists in their own heads. Long before any American law existed, though, a much older written tradition had already drawn a strikingly similar line, and it is worth pausing on because it complicates the idea that this taboo is either purely ancient instinct or purely modern legislation. The dietary code laid out in the book of Leviticus lists specific birds considered unfit to eat, and the list is remarkably close to the one this video keeps circling back to. It names the raven, the hawk, several kinds of owl, the vulture, and, by name, the gull. That text is roughly 3,000 years old, which means the specific instinct to separate grain-eating birds from scavenging and predatory ones has a documented paper trail stretching back millennia, not just a 1918 federal treaty, but a paper trail is exactly what it is. It is a written rule created by a specific religious and legal tradition for a specific population, not a universal biological reflex shared by every human culture everywhere. Plenty of other societies, across other parts of the world and other periods of history, ate seabirds, scavengers, and birds of prey without a second thought. What Leviticus and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act actually share is not proof of some deep instinct. It is proof that, twice, roughly 3,000 years apart. A specific culture sat down and wrote a formal rule singling out exactly this category of bird, which is a very different kind of evidence than an inherited biological aversion would be. That ancient text did not simply fade into irrelevance either. Observant Jewish dietary practice today still follows kosher rules directly descended from that same passage, meaning a written decision made roughly 3,000 years ago is still actively shaping which birds show up on some tables in America right now, independent of anything the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or a chicken's biology has to say about it. That gap between what any given rule permits and what people actually do gets a great deal more interesting once you look at what Americans were doing with crow only 2 or 3 generations ago. Because the idea that this taboo is ancient and instinctive runs directly into a documented episode that says otherwise. In the 1930s, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a local doctor and former county health official named T.W. Stallings began hosting crow banquets, serving crow meat to guests who were initially told they were eating quail. Once people learned what they had actually eaten and, according to newspaper accounts from the period, generally kept eating it anyway, Stallings turned the whole thing into a public campaign. Farmers wanted crows gone because of crop damage, and state officials realized that turning crow into a folk delicacy was good publicity for an extermination effort that was already underway. The craze spread well beyond one banquet hall. Newspapers reported butchers paying local children roughly $1.50 for every dozen crows they brought in. The governor of Oklahoma lent his name to something called the State House Crow Meat Lovers Association. Between 1934 and 1945, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation killed an estimated 3.8 million crows, largely through organized culls. Somewhere in the span of a single human lifetime, a wild scavenger bird went from a dinner served at a governor-endorsed banquet to a species almost nobody living today would consider food at all. That is not how an ancient, hardwired taboo behaves. Ancient taboos do not usually have a founding date, a founding doctor, and a newspaper archive documenting the exact years enthusiasm rose and fell. This one does, which means the real question is not why humans have always avoided crow. It is how a taboo that clearly did not exist in 1935 became so complete, so quickly, that most Americans alive today would assume it always had. Part of the answer is that even during the height of the craze, the meat itself was never an easy sell on its own merits. And that matters because it explains why the fad needed a doctor, a governor, and a dishonest introduction as quail to get off the ground in the first place. Crow is generally described by the people who have actually cooked it as dark, lean, and notably tough, closer in character to an intensely gamey duck or goose than to anything resembling chicken, and it typically demands long, slow, deliberate cooking, something closer to a stew or a braise, to become tender at all. That is a real, practical barrier that has nothing to do with disgust and everything to do with convenience. A fad that requires disguising the bird as something else and then convincing people to commit to a genuinely difficult cut of meat was always going to need constant institutional support to survive. From a health official, from a state government, from newspaper coverage, treating it as civic duty. The moment that support disappeared after the war, crow did not need a new taboo invented against it. It simply reverted to being exactly what it had always been on a dinner plate, a demanding piece of meat with no infrastructure left standing behind it. The second, deeper part of the answer is that crow eating never had real biology working in its favor to begin with. And once the wartime and post-war publicity around it faded, there was nothing underneath holding the practice up. This is where the genuine, separate, non-legal reasons finally enter the picture, because they are real and they matter. They simply are not the reason most people assume. Crows and gulls are both what biologists call generalist foragers, eating carrion, garbage, insects, eggs, and whatever else is available, and that diet leaves a chemical signature in the meat itself. Fish and other aquatic animals contain a compound called trimethylamine oxide, which is odorless on its own, but breaks down into trimethylamine once an animal starts digesting or storing it, and trimethylamine is the specific molecule responsible for what people describe as a fishy, faintly ammonia-like taste and smell. Gulls that feed heavily on fish and shellfish accumulate this compound directly in their tissue, in much the same way farmed fish raised on fish-based feed can pass a fishy taint into their own flesh and eggs. A chicken raised on grain simply never encounters that compound in any meaningful quantity. A gull that spends its life following fishing boats and scavenging shorelines is, at a molecular level, carrying around the flavor of its own diet in a way a grain-fed bird never does. That is a genuine, chemically documented reason gull meat tends to taste unpleasant to most people, independent of any cultural squeamishness about scavengers. It is worth noting that this effect is not identical across every gull population, since a gull scavenging mostly at an inland landfill is not accumulating trimethylamine the same way one following a fishing fleet along the coast is. The specific, unpleasant flavor most people associate with gull meat is really a description of a particular diet, not a fixed property of the species itself, which is exactly the kind of nuance a simple appeal to instinct tends to erase. There is a second, considerably more current reason to leave gulls off the menu, and this one has nothing to do with flavor at all. Wild aquatic birds, including gulls, ducks, geese, and shorebirds, are recognized by public health agencies as natural reservoirs for avian influenza. When a strain known as H5N1 arrived in North America in 2021, spreading from European wild bird populations, the earliest documented cases on this side of the Atlantic were found in black-backed gulls in Newfoundland, before the virus spread through wild bird populations across the continent. Health agencies in the United States now maintain active, ongoing surveillance specifically because these birds carry and spread the virus without necessarily showing obvious signs of illness themselves. Handling or eating an animal that functions as a natural reservoir for a virus, actively being tracked by national health agencies, is a fundamentally different kind of risk than a chicken raised in a controlled barn on a monitored feed. Schedule Ever presents. This is not a historical curiosity, the way the Oklahoma banquets are. It is an active, present tense reason public health officials would prefer people leave wild gulls alone, and it did not exist as a concern in anything like its current form during the 1930s crow craze, since the modern picture of avian influenza surveillance is a comparatively recent scientific development. And yet, even with all of that working against them, gulls have never been quite as absolute an exception as they first appear, which is the last complication this investigation owes you before pulling everything together. In parts of England today, it is legal to collect and sell the eggs of black-headed gulls specifically, under a license administered by a national conservation authority. Fewer than 100 licensed collectors, sometimes called eggers, are permitted to gather a strictly limited number of eggs each spring during a narrow window running from roughly the 1st of April to the middle of May. From a small number of approved sites, the eggs are sold as a genuine, seasonal delicacy, prized for a flavor and texture distinct from a chicken egg. And the entire practice exists specifically because regulators decided the harvest, tightly controlled, would not threaten the wider gull population. It is a narrow exception. Eggs, rather than meat. A handful of licensed people, rather than an open market. But it proves the same point the Oklahoma story proves, from a different angle. Even the animal treated as the least edible bird in America has, elsewhere, been formally, legally, deliberately turned back into food the moment a specific set of regulators decided the terms were acceptable. A short distance north, in the Faroe Islands, the exception goes further still. Under a hunting law dating back to 1954, seabirds remain the one category of wild bird islanders are still permitted to hunt, and a reduced, carefully regulated harvest of fulmars and puffins continues there today, alongside a licensed collection of a few thousand common guillemot eggs each year, granted through the local Natural History Museum. None of these are gulls specifically, but they occupy the exact same ecological role gulls do everywhere else. Coastal, fish-eating, colony-nesting seabirds, and an entire nation continues treating them as legitimate, regulated food while sustainability researchers openly debate whether even this reduced harvest still asks too much of the surrounding seabird population. Whether a given seabird counts as food, in other words, has never been a fixed biological fact anywhere on the planet. It has always been a decision, made locally, revisited periodically, and enforced only as strictly as the people making the decision choose to enforce it. An American reading about the Faroese guillemot harvest or the English gull egg season is not reading about some exotic exception to a universal human rule. They are reading about a version of the exact same decision the United States made differently, for its own specific legal and historical reasons. In 1918, Even if every law, every ancient text, and every ounce of cultural squeamishness vanished overnight, there is a final, purely economic reason neither bird would suddenly appear at the grocery store, and it has nothing to do with taste, disease, or history at all. Modern commercial chicken breeds, developed over roughly a century of deliberate selective breeding, can reach market weight in around 5 to 6 weeks, while converting less than 2 pounds of feed into every pound of body weight gained. A level of efficiency the poultry industry has spent decades refining specifically because it makes chicken remarkably cheap to produce at enormous scale. No equivalent breeding program has ever existed for crows or gulls because no one was ever legally permitted or economically motivated to spend a century selectively breeding a protected or semi protected wild bird for rapid, efficient growth. A crow raised from an egg would still be, biologically, essentially the same wild animal it has always been: slower to mature, less efficient at converting feed, and completely absent from the supply chains, hatcheries, and processing infrastructure that make chicken so cheap it barely requires a second thought at the supermarket. The taboo, in other words, is not the only thing standing between a crow and a dinner plate anymore. An entire century of industrial infrastructure was quietly built around one bird and never extended to the other, which means even a full cultural reversal tomorrow would still leave crow and gull meat, at least for the foreseeable future, rare, expensive, and thoroughly impractical to produce at any real scale. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it means the taboo and the industry reinforce each other in a way that is easy to miss. Nobody built a crow hatchery because the demand was never there to justify it. And the demand was never there partly because no efficient, affordable version of the bird existed to create that demand in the first place. Chicken did not simply win a fair contest against crow and gull on flavor or ethics. It had a century long head start in the one area: industrial breeding investment, that determines what actually becomes affordable and therefore normal on a family dinner table. Put all of that together, and the honest picture looks nothing like a single, tidy explanation. The taboo against eating a crow was not carved into humans by evolution the way an aversion to obviously spoiled meat might be. It was legal, cultural, and largely accidental, built on top of a written tradition in roughly 3,000 years old, formalized into modern American law in 1918, briefly and deliberately reversed by an Oklahoma publicity campaign in the 1930s, and then left to fade once the post-war world moved on to easier, cheaper, more centrally produced meat. Gulls never had a crow-style loophole for their meat. Their diet leaves a genuine and measurable trace in their flesh, and their current status as a documented viral reservoir gives modern health officials a real, current reason to keep people away from them that has nothing to do with how anyone feels about scavengers, even as a narrow, licensed exception for their eggs quietly continues an ocean away. What is genuinely uncertain, and worth being honest about, is how much of today's disgust reaction is inherited directly from these specific legal and cultural moments, versus how much would have developed anyway, on the strength of taste and disease risk alone. Even if the ancient dietary codes, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Oklahoma banquets had never happened at all, nobody has run that experiment, and nobody ever will. It is also worth admitting that some of the contamination fears attached to eating a city crow rest on thinner evidence than people assume. Researchers studying other crow species abroad, including hooded crows in parts of Europe and house crows across South Asia, have documented measurable lead and other heavy metal accumulation in urban populations, but a dedicated, food safety-focused study measuring exactly how much of that risk applies to American crow meat, specifically, at the levels someone would actually consume in a meal, is not something this research turned up. The suspicion is reasonable. The precise sourced number most people would want before deciding whether to eat one does not yet clearly exist. So the crow you could legally shoot this coming autumn in nearly every state in the country will almost certainly never appear on a menu. Not because the law forbids it, and not because it is some ancient, untouchable creature written into human instinct from the beginning. It stays off the plate because a written rule, 3,000 years old, and a federal law, 100 years old, happen to draw the same line. A 1930s publicity stunt briefly and artificially erased that line for one bird in one state, and everything since then has simply let the older, quieter default reassert itself. The seagull beside it never got a governor's endorsement or a banquet in its favor, only a diet that flavors its own meat, a documented role in spreading a virus we are still actively tracking, and, an ocean away, a licensed loophole reserved for its eggs and its seabird cousins rather than its own body. Neither bird ever had a century of selective breeding working in its favor either, which means the economics of the modern supermarket were quietly stacked against both of them long before anyone sat down to feel disgusted by either one. Two birds, several overlapping rules, and remarkably little of it has much to do with instinct at all. What does it tell you? That the line between food and taboo turned out to be this old in one direction, this recent in another, and this negotiable, at least in one narrow case, in a third. Leave your answer in the comments, and I will see you in the next investigation, when another ordinary rule gets taken apart the same careful way this one just was.